on today's episode of the Mythic Masculine.
As a therapist or facilitator, the more we explore and become open to all kinds of different possibilities, the more we disconnect from a particular paradigm or type of experience being the way, as if that needs to be the answer for everybody. And we meet somebody mindfully and openly and actually can build a resonance and rapport between systems so that I'm actually listening really deeply to what's going on the other side, and both right through the body, states of the mind, things that are coming up. Then essentially I'm more capable of attuning to them and, in a sense, like morphing or readjusting my shape to match what's needed in that moment to them. So it's like I might literally slip through, let's say, the transference of a motherly figure or a fatherly figure or a brother, or potentially for a woman that's experienced sexual abuse, potential perpetrator being transferred that direction. And then at that point in time, it's like basically allowing those perceptions to take place, and actually through that resonance, allowing my system to slow down and match where they're at. So I don't have to maintain my shape and my disposition, and meet them there, and then have the flexibility to actually shift my shape after that, allowing that to take shape for them so that there is that connection, and then actually lift up and out of that into a new possibility.
What does it mean to be a man today? And what is masculinity reclaimed from the toxic paradigm of domination and empire? In an era defined by polarized conflict and existential uncertainty, how can we draw upon ancient and emerging mythologies to navigate the terrain of imaginal possibility? This podcast explores the historical, cultural, and contemporary voices that are once again realigning masculinity with thriving life. Greetings, dear listener. I'm your host, Ian McKenzie. My guest today is Trevor Yelich, an alternative therapist specializing in breathwork, somatic psychotherapeutics, and trauma work. He is the founder of Numa Somatics and the Numa Mystery School. This episode was recorded a few months ago, immediately after I completed an in-person training with Trevor in psychotherapeutics, which I very much enjoyed. Many of the principles and practices I found quite complementary to my existing experience facilitating groups, and I found Trevor to be highly intelligent, warm, and compassionate. In this episode, Trevor shares his take on navigating a transformative phase of life, characterized by shifts in work, relationships, and self-awareness. He delves into the concept of the Chiron return, its significance in astrology, and how it has impacted his own journey as a healer. Trevor also explores the therapeutic potential of psychedelic experiences, the dynamics of embodying both masculine and feminine energies, and the Hakomi principle of organicity, emphasizing the natural self-organizing processes that guide personal and collective healing through deep, empathic connection. A heads up, the Mythic Masculine is evolving as well. You are welcome to check out my website to see upcoming in-person and online courses, trainings, as well as how to become a paid supporter on Substack. I don't accept advertising and rely on listeners like you to fund the show. Visit themythicmasculine.com for more details. And now, enjoy my conversation with Trevor Yelich. Welcome, Trevor, to the show.
Thank you, Ian. Happy to be here.
Could you please spend a moment just describing where we are in this moment for you personally? It could be geographically, spiritually. I always love to have the listener attuned to the guest in this moment.
I am here in Calgary, Alberta, Canada, and I am, where am I? I'm kind of in the midst of a liminal period in my life. Lots changing, and quite frankly, a lot of unknowns unfolding as far as like what's next. So it's been a pretty big past 9 months, and it feels like it's not quite done yet. So where I am is in the midst of another big change in my journey.
Would you speak a bit of what that change is?
I mean, quite frankly, it's been a change in pretty much every aspect of my life. Relationally, over the past 9 months, it's been a change in locations for work and even the types of work that I'm doing. I mean, I'm still in the similar territory, but yeah, starting to flesh out new possibilities with it, engaging different audiences, different means of doing what I do with those audiences. So, but a lot of it is hovering on a sense of possibility that's unfolding, and there's not 100% clarity around it yet. So, yeah, trusting the process that it's coming.
Feels like a liminal time.
Definitely liminal. Yeah, which feels really precious, but at the same time, it's like a little bit anxiety provoking at times.
Yeah.
I'm in between. I'm turning 51 soon, and for anybody that's kind of tuned into astrology, it's my time for Chiron return, which seems to be another big shift energetically for me, and I'm feeling it immensely.
No, I'm a little familiar with the Chiron return. Is that the wounded healer? Yeah,
it is.
Yeah,
strangely enough, since the type of work that I'm doing.
Interesting theme, for the conversation. Well, I'd love to share a little context too of why this conversation is happening. And I've just gotten out of your 5-day transformational psychotherapeutic training, module 1, of which I felt the call to attend after one of your longtime students, Deus Forte, who folks who've listened to previous podcast episodes with myself and Deus, they'll know as well. Deus and I have been co-offering men's spaces, particularly around the themes of masculinity, myth, somatics. And Deus speaks very highly of you and the work that you've done, and what he's learned off you as well. And so he encouraged me to come and seek out some of your teachings and your skill set. And so I can say 5 days now on the end of it, this is the day after the training has ended, and I am very grateful for my experience in that realm. And it really clicked a lot of pieces for me, that I've been somewhat putting together a bit on my own, a bit through other modalities. And I really appreciated the specificity in a way and the practicality of tools and frameworks around the therapeutic process. And my question to you, actually, as I was even in the training, and I was like, I kind of want to ask this, but maybe I'll wait till now, which is simple stuff to start. But what is therapy?
Oh my goodness. It's a big question. And we talked a little bit about this in the training, because there can be a lot of different takes on it. And a lot of people are coming to, let's say, therapy, if we want to call it that, to typically shift something in their life, to feel better in some way, to be able to connect with somebody that's understanding or could help. And while I'd say that all of that holds true, at least the framework that this last training was operating within, and it holds true for a fair amount of the work that I do, the idea behind therapy is that we're essentially setting the container, a safe enough container and a brave enough container, that we can actually start to dive into the underlying framework that we perceive our lives and really reality through. So with the idea that the content doesn't necessarily have to change to actually be happy in life, to be content with life, to feel better in relationships and be able to relate better. Sometimes it's just really adjusting the filters, which a lot of modalities and people are teaching about. But it's more of like adjusting the programming than it is just switching content. We're not trying to simply soothe by doing something that immediately makes you feel better. Because if that's removed, that typically changes. So it's like, how do we adjust the way we interface with each other and with life?
And I would expect people listening, if they have any experience with therapy or not, there might be perception still broadly of like, oh, you go to therapy because something's wrong or broken or you need to be fixed or something. And the more that I also step into this realm as well, to me, that doesn't fit actually, right? A sense of, and then you get back to, I don't know what, being perfect or something. And you used a metaphor of a house one time that I thought, in the training was helpful. Maybe you could offer that here.
Yeah, I would love to. I offer this at times to my clients to help make sense of it, because people come in going, is this going to take 1 time, 10 times? How long are we going to be doing this for? What needs to be done? And the way that I typically convey my perspective on it is that it is very much like a house. And there are periods of time after time where significant renovations are necessary, where you might be tearing down walls, you might be completely doing an interior redesign, or repair to the structure. And those can be labor intensive. You may very well have to spend a lot of dedicated time and intense time exploring those territories to actually make those changes. But in between those changes, there might be a smaller job that comes up with regards to painting a wall. And in even smaller jobs, let's say on a weekly or bi-weekly basis, where you're simply cleaning your house. And that work, like a house, just happens because life happens. So not to say that people are constantly needing to come back to therapy, but there is a sense of we're living life. Stress happens. Life happens. Relationships can be stressful, and or work and other efforts. And we need to tidy up at times and tend to things.
You know, I'm remembering just recently on Twitter, actually, or I guess it's called X now because it's Elon Musk, but he tweeted something like, "Put never went to therapy on my gravestone," or something like that, right? This is, I mean, he's a trickster, of course, but there's something very defiant, right, about that. It's like, my translation of that is someone who's like, you know, I've never felt broken enough to go, like, as in I don't need that kind of thing. Like, it's a bit of a kind of weakness, like to go to therapy must be a weakness. And, you know, here he is putting himself up, which to me makes him, of course, even more recklessly untrustworthy with the amount of wealth that any human, let alone a man who's not willing to go to therapy, should be entrusted with. And so there is something still, right, of a bit of a stigma or something, right, in some cases. But the more and more I step into this work, right, the more I'm like, oh, this is like, yeah, it's like the skill of being human, really, right, and understanding your own shadows or the own traumas you've experienced, and, you know, how to work with them in a way that leads to more generativity and more aliveness.
Yeah, absolutely. And well, for one, I don't push the idea of therapy on anybody. It's if they're called to it, if they're curious about it, great. If they are basically encountering enough stress in life that continuing the way that they're continuing doesn't seem functional anymore, that it's coming with more pain than the pain or discomfort of coming to therapy to work on it, then that's a great time to engage that. You know, and if they're not feeling that, and they're kind of curiously, or not even curiously, but just moving forward and creating in life and doing what they do, then that's, I mean, I'm not in opposition to that. Mm-hmm. From an outside perspective, do I potentially see them moving through life with unquestioned paradigms and potentially making choices and operating relations in ways that might not be optimal for other people? Absolutely. But at the same time, for myself, especially when I'm networking with potential clients and whatnot, it's I don't feel like it's my place to make that call for them. Mm-hmm. It's, for me, it's really about, are they curious about it or not? And if they are, I'll engage them in it. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I'm curious what drew you to this work then, that you've now found yourself seemingly deeply dedicated to, that, you know, you shared a bit in the training as well. There was quite a number of modalities and paths that you explored and have incorporated. And I'm curious, even perhaps before that, like, was this always a calling, or was this something that came on, you know, to your interest and passion later in life?
Yeah. It came on fairly young, more in a perception of reality sense, exploring what it was to be alive and be conscious, be aware. And at a fairly young age, I got into Taoism and reading those teachings. And then as I moved through college, I got more and more into martial arts, which I always wanted to do as a child and never really accessed. And that got me into breathwork and different types of meditation. And that led into practicing yoga. And the more I was working with people in those fields, teaching and sharing those practices, the more I was starting to get really curious about the human experience and the emotional energies, the signatures that were stored in the body, and the stories that were arising. And quite honestly, I was maybe a little bit too bold or brave to try to engage that and start working with it as if I could from, you know, the philosophies of yoga or different things in martial arts. And my main way of learning was actually kind of backwards, in the sense that I didn't go, oh, I want to be a psychologist, I'm going to go train to be a psychologist. It's more like, I have a certain amount of skill set, I see a need for something else here, I'm going to try and do it, which for some people isn't necessarily an applauded direction. But for me, it continually ran me up against the edge of what I don't know. And then I would seek it out and continue to study. So over the years, I've basically become a bit of a mutt. It's like piecemealing together a wide variety of different trainings and life experiences that were basically just answering an array of, or a stream of questions that came from encountering territory that I really didn't know about. I didn't know what I was doing. And I would, go look for those answers.
And somewhere in there, you went to Burning Man, I was told just prior. And be curious to know, what year was that, and how did that come about?
That was 2009. Meeting a wide variety of people in the community here in Calgary that were interested in, or had been going for a number of years down to Burning Man. And I was going through a dark night of the soul, if I could use that term. And I'm not using it lightly in this case, because it was a prolonged, probably about 8-year period where I was staring down my life over and over again and questioning things and having experiences that would crack me open to like spiritual experience and new possibilities. But then I was actually, for a while there, quite taking it from quite an egoic perspective of like me being something special. I was going to like change things here in this world and had a mission. But on the other side of that, the shame kept me crashing and searching. And Burning Man to me at that point in time, as it's often pitched, like this paradigm of being with others and this potential new world, in a sense. And the ego side of me was really curious about getting down there and even like establishing myself, like letting my presence be known, because I could like be part of that and partake in it in good ways that would hopefully be helpful to others. And then the shame side of me just collapsed on the other side as I was actually flip-flopping pretty strongly at that point in time. Hence kind of the flavor of the dark night of the soul as I was searching. Yeah. So Burning Man was, it was beautiful. There were so many rich moments and gorgeous connections and the artistry and the consciousness that went into numerous aspects of it. And parts of it were completely heartbreaking. I saw some of the most devastating aspects of human nature as well at moments. And by myself, it was a humbling moment that really turned me back towards sitting down and turning inwards and seeing what was up.
I just realized too, that was my first year, 2009. Okay. Exactly, yeah. And I ended up going 6 times in a row, and it became really like the yearly pilgrimage, and of course different communities of people I was connected with, we'd go down. And it wasn't until 2014, so this is my last time, that I finished a film. My previous film was called Amplify Her, and it was looking at the rise of the feminine through artists, female DJs and producers. And the last scenes we shot at Burning Man that year. But I remember finishing the shoot and going out on like I think it was the Sunday night, right? So basically the man's burn the night before, and the Sunday is the temple burn, right? Which if you stayed for, it's very powerful.
Yeah, I did.
And I remember that sunrise on the Sunday that I had this feeling. I was like, ooh, I don't think I'll be back, actually. And I had no other reason to think that other than just felt true. And it's been true. Since then I just haven't felt the call. But certainly it was really transformative in my own past and the trajectory of my life. And it strikes me what is important about, of course, a lot of people do psychedelics at Burning Man, but the whole thing is like a psychedelic experience, right? Some terms that people use are temporary autonomous zone, right? Another one I like is synchronistic field, right? Where because people are outside of their comfort and sort of habitual patterns of relating, of living, that they're opened themselves up to more of a possibility, right? Of just where does the mystery of life want to go? And, I remember having this feeling often where I'd get to like the playa, the main area there, and I'd kind of look at a direction and I'd be like, any direction I go will be amazing, and that is not usually the feeling I get, when I'm walking around a city, right? Like Calgary, I might, because there's all these ways of, I would say the lack of trust, right? Is really a big piece of why people don't feel as open, right? Because it's like, but something is possible there, which seems not possible elsewhere. And so anyway, I wanted to bring that up to speak about, your experience of, and also a bit of a segue into this, really like this principle of life and emergence, right? That for me, that was some of the first times that I experienced this because of my own sense of openness and the openness of other people, that what became possible, what threads of connection and adventure, became possible were beyond what I could have imagined. And I wonder for you as well, is that something you also experienced, or is that something you have experienced in other, alternative, psychedelic realms, that kind of thing?
Definitely happened at Burning Man, and even more so for myself, even more so within different containers that people have struck over the years that I participated in within the psychedelic realm, for sure. For me, and tying it back into the training we just finished, which was largely influenced by a school of thought known as Hakomi, the initial part of the process, a big part of the process, is striking the therapeutic relationship, entering mindfulness, and evoking experiences to experiment with how we relate to things and ourselves. And I would relabel those now, compared to how they were originally described, as entering a non-ordinary relationship, entering non-ordinary states of consciousness, and having non-ordinary experiences, which often come in the form, in this case, as experiments. It's like, if I try this, what happens? And when we enter the field with that much possibility and the freedom to reflect on it from that non-ordinary state of consciousness, which in mindfulness means essentially that you've got some space around it, you can view things with some equanimity or calmness, you know, sometimes referred to as neutrality, which isn't necessarily a great way to refer to it, but things can change. And one of the ways, and things will often spontaneously change and emerge. And one of the ways that I would describe how that's working is it's essentially taking our focus off of whatever we would normally attend to and provides the capacity to see the larger context, see other elements that are happening. And it's not that the other elements are even more important. It's that it's actually broadening or expanding our mind so that more elements are present. And then we have space to move. We have space to wander and explore and potentially have a new experience or learn how to relate to things in a new way. I used to do, every once in a while, I'll still do this little practice where I'll have people like hold a block, let's say one of those foam blocks from yoga classes or something, in front of their face a little ways out and label it as their anger. And then invite them to like stare at it intently and try to walk through the entire room and navigate the room around others and whatever else is in the room while they're fixated on that anger. And just to notice how that feels in their body. And what's often the case is there's tensions, there's uncertainties, anxieties and whatnot, because they're not peripherally as aware of things or the space around them. And then I'll have them replace that block or reassign the block so that now it means fixated on love. I'm just this loving individual. This is who I am all the time, something that I'm heavily identified with. And if they're fixated on the block and love, they still have that same friction. There's still a concern when they're walking around, like they're not quite present to everything else around them. So for me, then it's like, I'll give them a couple blocks. One can be anger, one can be love. And they've got one in each hand and they can see them. But if they go peripheral so that both of those blocks are there, and in that peripheral, or global attention, what else happens? The room becomes accessible. There's space to move. And all of a sudden there's ease in navigating around other people or relating to them, ease in navigating the environment. So part of the therapeutic process is how do I unhook from a focal point that I've habituated to, even unconsciously. I don't even realize that I've identified with it so strongly, and allow for more detail to be present at the same time so that I can actually have space. And when I can move freely, I can think more freely, can be a bit more creative about my solutions to things, right? And those possibilities emerge. That emergence happens.
Well, it strikes me as like one of the things that I, my own path in terms of, personal growth, self-inquiry, spiritual inquiry is I did a Vipassana, a 10-day Goenka, that's that whole thing about, I think it was 25. And again, I was called to it. I was also exploring Taoism and Buddhism and, really like, this is it. And then it was like a random encounter. I was in Vancouver at a SkyTrain station or something. And a street busker, I was like, walking by and his music was beautifully, I think it was more Peruvian, that style with the flutes. Yeah. And, I gave him some money and he's like, hey, have you heard of Vipassana? And I was like, no. And he's like, you should go, and gave me their website. And, I thought, okay, that's spirit. Maybe he was doing that to everybody, but I felt like, okay, this is it. And then I ended up going and I did the 10 days and it was hard. I'll say it was very hard. And yet one of the gifts of that time was of this intense mindfulness right over the 10 days was I really felt for the first time the gap between stimulus and response. Yeah. Right. And that to me was, beyond an idea of it, I actually had an experience of it. Right. That slowed down enough. It was like, oh, stimulant comes in. And there's a moment, a crack, where I can be mindful of that, and then a response comes, right? And in that gap, seems like everything becomes possible, right? Once there's not an automatic, habitual reaction to something.
Yep. Yeah, totally. And in that sense, tying it into what I was saying a few moments ago, the fact that there is that gap, even if it's a temporal gap or time gap, apparently showing up in the moment, because it's always just apparent. Slipping that in there, you have space around what transpired so that you do have another possibility showing up. And even at first, that other possibility is just that you are not entirely that experience. You're not completely identified with it. So there's automatically two different things there. There's an observer and there's the experience when that identification starts to loosen up. And that is often enough to start creating the space for that emergence to happen.
I love this thread. And I want to weave in one other pathway here, which is around masculinity. Because of course, this is the mythic masculine, and some conversations, they go very elliptically around the subject matter. And yet, I'm curious for you, just what, as you reflect on your upbringing, and what was your relationship to what you understood masculinity to be? Like, was it something easy to perform? Was it something that was, difficult and troubling? Role models you might have had to say, oh yeah, this is the masculinity I want, or this is definitely what I don't want. I'd be curious to hear some of that.
Yeah. Sitting with where to start with that. Mm-hmm. When I was growing up, I would definitely say there was role modeling of those specific, like, traditional roles, unquestioned traditional roles. And there was definitely shaming within the house around sexual exploration, sexual curiosity. So there wasn't a lot of great support from my parents for understanding that. And
meaning when you sort of like in teen years, you mean, as you started to be
even younger, but definitely in teen years, definitely some abuse and shaming, strong shaming around that territory. Which made it difficult, but at the same time, my personal defense around that was to basically become rebellious and do it anyways, but just not within their presence, like hiding things that way. So, and exploring and experimenting and whatnot. But to tie it back into the sense of masculinity, even though there was, like, again, in more of that unquestioned traditional sense, there was a demonstration of those roles happening. Definitely nobody ever really talked about it. I definitely adopted things unconsciously as modes of operation. And at the same time, it was balanced by my mom, who really was determined to just take care of things. And she definitely had a lot of masculine energy with regard, if we define it in ways that in some circles commonly define masculine energy. Again, up for debate, question.
And by that meaning like achievement, or like kind of holding things together?
Success oriented, or like goal oriented. Yeah. And much more rational, not necessarily, even though she was emotionally reactive, she wasn't necessarily accessing a broad range of emotional sensitivity or intelligence at that time. And seeing her in that role and just basically doing whatever she wanted to do, she was governing her world. She would step in and take care of things. She would be at the school or wherever she was at and really being a force of leadership, and had a hard time really differentiating that from my father's role. And I would have to say that, and even to this day, to a fault, I think, like, it's been actually really hard for me to understand the idea of women being subjugated to certain roles or marginalized in various ways. I've had to actually learn to look for that, because the way that my mom was, I just assumed that a woman or transgender or non-gendered, anybody is equal to me. Like, it hasn't even been a question in my system. But because of that, I've also overlooked where that marginalization's happened, and the pains and the trauma that's come from it, and how it's constantly played out in society. So that's been a big learning over the past number of years, to like attune to that and actually recognize how prevalent it is. And fortunately, with a variety of like conscious and amazing partners, I've been able to learn that in good ways. So, but it's also at the same time over the years been an opportunity to really get clear on what it even means for me. And at one point in time, I was prescribing a lot to people like David Data and exploring in those ways. And at this point in time, I don't so much. I mean, some of their teachings still influence to some degree as points of possibility. But for me, everything's up for experimentation and exploration. And I don't really trust any particular point of view as if it's the right answer. And myself and my own sexuality, even though I present quite well as just being cis male, I feel quite fluid. I feel like I've really lots of times just as feminine as I am masculine, if I was going to try and create some kind of polarity. Yeah.
Thank you for that. You brought up David Data again. I mean, I've read The Way of the Superior Man as well. I mean, that's his, I think, big one. But of course, I think he's moved on a fair bit since then. But, the classic kind of distillation, it seems, of that take on things is sort of neo-tantric take, right? Which is like the feminine is chaos, right? And the man is rationality in the container. And there's another interview with Christopher Ryan, he wrote the book Sex at Dawn, but he has a great podcast episode called The Way of the Inferior Man, where he kind of takes apart that. Right. And again, I don't want to cast David. Maybe David has, gotten much more sophisticated in his later stuff, but there is something around this. Yeah. You talk about fluidity, polarity, which is interesting, that can be helpful in, now I'm going to bring it back to the therapeutic space, because, what I find in working with men as well is that getting in touch with their quote feminine, right, seems to be a pretty deep theme within that space. And so in some sense, I would be willing to characterize one of the consequences of growing up in a again, I use patriarchy very specifically because, I could go down a long tangent about how that can be very unhelpful as far as a term. Mm-hmm. But if we just agree that we're in a culture where men are essentially conditioned into being less sensitive, right, for different reasons, but essentially not rewarded for sensitivity, typically, or vulnerability, particularly in certain kinds of jobs and, certain kinds of cultures of kind of masculinity, that the therapeutic process requires a degree of willingness to surrender to a deeper vulnerability. I mean, does that seem to be the case for you now in terms of when you work with men?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say ultimately, as far as surrendering to a deeper vulnerability, that's going to stand true for pretty much everybody. And when it comes to exploring our tender territories, mm-hmm. maybe looking a little bit different at times between men and women, I think there's a couple of things up for me. One, in your description of recognizing that many men are actually maybe requiring for good effect of the therapy, turning towards their feminine. I'd say that, people like Jung a long time ago spoke of one of the primary explorations and connections that can be made for each person is basically tuning into their anima or animus, their opposite inside. So the internalized feminine for myself, or masculine for a woman, mm-hmm. right? Or potentially for trans or non-binary, some other combination of that. Mm-hmm. And when I'm working with men, tuning into their feminine is also an opportunity to develop more connection to their own emotional sensitivity and softening kind of some of the shells that have maybe been created to manage or protect against things. And at the same time, relationally, it's creating more capacity to build rapport and resonate with someone of the opposite sex. And this is kind of jumping a little bit here, but tying it back into the idea of masculine, feminine, and older ideas around it, I think I don't really have any problem with a binary sense of like yin and yang or something's hot, something's cold. It's more when that gets overlapped as a definition of somebody. It
like an identity? Yeah, like an identity structure.
Identity. And even like to say, and actually data did speak of this, to say that a man is basically the embodiment of masculine traits is denying the fact that there is a percentage of the man that has feminine traits. So what I've seen in a variety of men's processes, I've participated a bit over the years in those, is that at least some of the older stylings of them really try to foster the masculine, as if that was what it was to be, what it was for a man, like to step up and really truly be a man in this world. And it was leaving half of them behind. Mm-hmm. Right. So for me, it's much more of a holistic picture of masculine and feminine at the same time. Or to back it off of those terms, because if they're still utilized as like male female, which they're really not, yin yang, and that in the teachings of Chinese medicine, which is part of my background, yin and yang, that seeming polarization is actually just one relative to the other. Something is only yang with respect to something that's more yin. It's a very relative designation. It's not black and white, literally in contrast, as if something's always yang. A candle flame is yang compared to the heat of my body. It'll burn me, but the sun is yang compared to the candle flame. Candle flame would be yin compared to it. So even my femininity might appear to be masculine compared to somebody that's more feminine in nature. Right?
Yeah, I hear this like almost a subjective sort of dynamism with, what particular elements are relating to each other in a particular moment, right? Right. Change in terms of the flavor, you could say.
Totally. And then to bring that into therapy, I'm not so interested in cultivating one of those or the other. It's more where, with a person presenting in a particular way and maybe having a particular balance that's already struck between those seeming roles or energies, where are the friction points? Where are we hung up? Where is it habituated? Or what might I be dissociating from and trying to avoid? And more than anything, I'm just trying to shed light on a bigger spectrum of what it is to be that person with a lot of curiosity so that they can have a new experience of themselves and trust that their own system in its emergence will have its own innate intelligence, its organicity to actually unfold in a direction that serves it and its relations well or better. Yeah.
Well, this is helpful too, because I'm glad you bridged to organicity as a principle, I believe. And was it coined by Ron Kurtz as part of Hakomi, or did he pick it up somewhere?
That is a good question. I don't know if he picked it up someplace.
Okay.
He's who I received it through, but I don't know if he technically got it from some other location.
Okay.
Yeah.
And this is to me helpful too, of some of the groundwork of the territory, because I think, again, people may have a bit of understanding of therapy. Maybe the term is psychoanalytical, perhaps, like this Freudian model of you're laying on a couch, the guy is just talking to you, or you're just talking, he's just scribbling notes. There might have been a Far Side cartoon I think I saw one time, where the therapist is like, doodling or something while the guy is talking. And
right.
So it's a bit of a cynical look, of course, at that kind of therapy and at sort of disconnect and, coldly being observed. And then they tell you what's going on for you. But this is clearly not what this process is. And I think represented largely too by this phrase or term, organicity. And I'd love for you to spend a bit more time in saying, how does that relate to the role of the therapist in this model in a partnership with this kind of intelligence, right, that is present in the body, like present in the patterns that are showing up, let's say, in a client, and how the therapist can attune and be in alignment with that?
So there's a wide variety of therapies out there, and there's even more variety within the therapists that are applying those therapies, because each person will have their own personal perspective or slant on the learnings that they've received. So I definitely hesitate to box anything in as like being one way or the other. Mm-hmm. In general, the approach that you were speaking of, like a psychoanalytic, or maybe what could be coined more of a talk therapy, if we take it in its kind of bare bones sense, without all the modifications that might arise from practitioner to practitioner, we could see it as potentially being a little bit more narrow towards the story being really important that's being told, and fleshing out that story, telling it in certain ways. Maybe they get into like dream work or other types of work to support the deeper aspects of those stories. There's a variety of ways that people will work with that. And they might work with behaviors in life and trying to repattern those behaviors in one way or another, which in a sense is a form of embodiment. The difference here within this framework is we attempt to, within fairly short order, make a shift from story to the storyteller, under the premise that the story that the client or that the person is living with is to some degree, or possibly to a very large degree, embodied in them right in this moment. And the way that they're sitting here with me, their posture, what they're feeling, and how they're relating to me, the tone of their voice, their cadence, right, or pace with speech, volume, gestures, right, emotional energy. It's all relevant of the stories that they're carrying, the filters that they're seeing life through, and they're interfacing or meeting with me with those flavors. So if I keep reverting to a cognitive state, trying to assess and help guide them through the story of their life, and maybe imagine other variations on that and form some new beliefs around it, kind of staying up in the head level of things, and potentially linking to past and future, and not really landing in this present moment, and how that story is actually alive right here. Mm-hmm. So as soon as we start to slow down and engage the body with sensations, feelings, emotional energy, all the gestures and postural changes, we can start to, in essence, get the energy of the living story that's expressing itself right now. And when we slow down and actually locate that, then that living story is actually where we can start to make changes, rather than expecting those changes to come from rethinking of the past or anticipating something different for the future. That's not necessarily to say that those aren't part of the process, but they're just not the whole process. We want to bring everything into it that's alive in this moment.
And I want to highlight again the shift from the story to the storyteller, right, that you named. And, for me, this is also links to, as I look out on the field of healing, or, Instagram influencers or men's work, and there seems to be very much a kind of this sense of embodiment, or like it's got to be embodied, right, integrated in the body and all this stuff. And I remember actually probably about 4 years ago, I was at a Sacred Sons gathering. Sacred Sons are, they're sort of a next generation men's group, men's work, and they're going quite big now, and they really lean on the practice within the trainings, or the convergences, as they call them, which is very similar. And I first experienced in the Mankind Project, which you may be familiar with. They're one of the oldest sort of men's initiatory groups, and the Sacred Sons somewhat grew out of them to the next generation. But their particular modality, I suppose, I experienced it as a support person, in the space, but it was essentially there would be a few facilitators, and the men would gather around, and then they basically say, what's present, right? So just, where's the energy in this moment, and they would then proceed to move through it. And I think I learned later that this is heavily on Alexander Lowen's, I think, right? The bioenergetics. Yeah, I think that's probably largely where they've gotten that stuff from. But it was interesting to me that so little story was said, You know, like they, you know, a guy would be like, yeah, you know, it relates to, and they'd just be like, nope, and just really go for the energy and follow it down. And like, does it want sound? And does it, you know, and pretty quick there would be a guy, you know, I remember one massively tattooed dude just like raging while, you know, the other guys are like holding his arms and he's like swearing about, maybe it was his dad, you know, when he was young, or maybe somebody that hurt his partner in the past or something, you know, this kind of stuff. And it was fascinating to me that could be accessed just by following energy down. And at the same time, this push for the big cathartic something also felt a bit dangerous, right, to me.
Right.
That not just with Sacred Sons, but there's some kind of perception as well that it is the big cathartic something that leads to transformation, right? And I'd be curious for you to speak a bit more of that, like the danger of that, you know, and how to, I don't know, be aware, right, of like what is the range, you know, that can lead to real transformation.
Right. First off, I'd love to say that I enjoy big processes for myself. I enjoy like a full range of experience. I'm definitely not a type of trauma therapist or facilitator that wants to shy away from those places out of the idea that they don't serve any role whatsoever, or that they could be like utterly all the time dangerous. Definitely, I believe that changes can distinctly come from those bigger experiences, sometimes dramatic changes. But there also lies the problem in the sense that, and the work we did over the last 5 days has a somewhat similar feel to the Sacred Sons, in the sense of like not worrying about the story so much. We might hear a sentence of it or a couple words and already have a sense of what's alive there, and we can start following that and dropping in. The challenge is if we continue to do that relentlessly, going in and in and in, we can push into a breakthrough type experience where there could be big emotional releases, there could be big shifts for somebody, but we've also at that exact same time potentially bypassed 5 or 10 different parts of that person that we're trying to protect against that happening because they were scared of what was going to happen if they went in there. And it's easy to believe that because we got to the gold in the mine that it was actually okay, and not realizing that we wore out the stability of the mountain and the mine's about to collapse, so to speak, to put a little bit of an analogy in there. So what can often happen for those bigger breakthrough processes, even though good can definitely come from them, and I've experienced that for myself, is that there'll be a number of defensive parts of that person that have not been attended to, they haven't been befriended or understood for their functioning and why they're there. And they will tend to experience that breakthrough as potentially as a point of not being heard and potentially being threatened, so that they might tighten up on the defenses. So you often will find a lot of people after having a big breakthrough experience having a kickback where there's some kind of habit that returns, or there's some kind of framework in mind that might even tighten up a little bit more. They might even get a little bit gun shy, so to speak, of certain processes and fearful of going back in. And those are actually the defenders or protectors in the person's system that are basically saying, hey, like, you didn't listen to me before, don't do that again. So how do we as facilitators of whether they're group processes or individual processes, how do we bookmark those protectors if we're going through them, so that once you have that big breakthrough, you can come back around and actually tend to the protective parts, so that they're really consciously being engaged and befriended if needed. And if you're not getting so hung up on the build up and breakthrough, those big experiences, how do you tend to them along the way and make friends with them? Each from, let's say, an internal family systems perspective, and that's definitely not the only style work that's available. They would essentially say that each of those protective parts actually has a creative energy. They have a gift, and it's more a matter of befriending them and helping that child self or that part of self realize that there is a different circumstance happening now. It's a different time, a different place. There's a different possibility with different people. And there might actually be safety now to relate, safety to express, safety for whatever they were originally heard around. And as that happens, the pressure can come off that part, and we can start to actually relate with it in a better way. And the need for it to manage or protect starts to subside. And then we can access the creative potential, and then we can drop in deeper and deeper and get to what would have been that cathartic and big release. But it often seems much less volatile at that point in time, because our protectors aren't trying to hold us back from it out of fear. So when it's done really thoroughly, the final transformation point where you hit that big breakthrough actually can feel uneventful, because it's like, of course, right? It's like you've revealed everything so softly on top of it that when you land there, it's like, finally, yeah. It's not some massive cataclysmic event because everything's fighting against it. One of my previous teachers for bodywork, Chiron, a type of visceral manipulation from Taoist traditions, once said that the degree of catharsis is often related to the degree of resistance to the process.
Yeah, that's interesting then, because what I see in what you're saying, and also in, again, not that Sacred Sounds is the only place that pushes for big catharsis. I mean, often, in transformational festivals and all this stuff, there's this sense of like, yeah, unless you're weeping by the end or raging, somehow we didn't hit the mark. But I hear in what you're saying a kind of, like if a process is moved too quickly, that's where there would likely be a lot of resistance, right? Because it's like, in the same way that, if you're walking down the street and all of a sudden somebody tried to tackle you or something, like, of course you're going to resist likely, right? With pretty intensely. But if it's a slower approach, theoretically, I would think there would be less resistance and therefore perhaps a gentler arrival, in some sort of transformational moment.
Totally. Yeah. For those folks that, and this may be triggering to even have this suggested or think about it, but for those folks that have encountered car accidents, it might be a nice example of like, because you're hurtling towards something, even if it's theoretically positive, because you're hurtling towards it, the speed of change that's happening in the system can often be overwhelming, and the system will brace against it. And then we have to break through that brace to actually get to the other side, which seems productive at the time. But then we have to go back and really repair the broken relations with that part of us that was scared of doing that, and we push through anyways.
Yeah, you just brought up, I was in a head-on collision actually about 7 years ago, but longer story behind it. But one thing that just I was reminded of was the car, actually, we were at a stoplight, my friend and I, and a car was driving, well, on the other side of the lane, but in our direction towards us. And then it crossed over the center line and then just rammed right into us. Oh, wow. But it was wild to me that the difference of time between, hey, wait, that car is in our lane, to all of a sudden smashed, airbag deployed. I can't not forget the scent of the airbag, right? The dust or whatever that is. Like from that's the moment. All of a sudden, it was that moment, and like that time in between was so. I couldn't even comprehend like bracing or not. It seemed, but my body, of course, I think did so, because all of a sudden that's what was occurring. Right. And then it was suddenly on the other side of that moment, and then I was wandering. Thankfully, I wasn't hurt actually significantly at all. The car was totaled. But yeah, it was very clear to me that there was this body brace, right? That was just so automatic, like the mind wasn't even able to comprehend it in time, right. but the body had a moment to. But yeah,
the body's registering all kinds of stuff. There's we don't need to get into this tangent necessarily, but the body's picking up things even when you're unconscious in surgeries because of the medications that have been used. It's a lot of unconscious states that might be experienced. There's nothing saying that your body is not picking up all kinds of traumatic signatures from that. Mm-hmm. Or I should say stressful signatures, because trauma inevitably is more the way that we relate to those stress signatures rather than an experience itself. But.
Well, I mean, just to name two, the module 2 goes into trauma, I understand, as the main of this transformational psychotherapeutics. Yeah. But one thing I wanted to now shift to is one, popularity of, and the rise of psychedelic therapy, right? Which I thought another author, sort of colleague, friend, Daniel Pinchbeck, he wrote a book called Breaking Open the Head back in, I think it was maybe early 2000s maybe. But he names this a few times. He's like, at the time, that was one of the first sort of psychedelic inquiry books. And at the time, he was on the cover of the Rolling Stone, and it was still like a big thing. And of course now with Michael Pollan's book, and it just seems like there's been a sea change, of course, right, in the use of psychedelics in therapy. And largely it seemed through the gateways of like post-traumatic stress with soldiers, right, returning soldiers, maybe with psilocybin, right, I think seemed to be like
for recent studies.
Yeah, recent studies. And so I'm just curious, what do you make of that, right, like this sort of this new surgence, of course, because I guess back in the 60s, 70s, before a lot of it was criminalized, that it seemed like a lot kind of had to go underground for a time, obviously, and now it seems to really be flowering. But I'm curious to you, what do you make of this sort of new renaissance of psychedelic therapy? Also one who offers, right, that psychedelic assisted therapy. And maybe I'll start there, is what is the benefit that you've seen in those spaces by incorporating those medicines that include some of the like non-ordinary state, pattern interrupt, like what's the benefit actually of having medicines that you've seen in these spaces?
Yeah, introducing medicines into these therapeutic spaces allows people, again, just like you said, to enter non-ordinary states of consciousness, it starts to alter our perception around what it is that we're perceiving, which one gives us some space from it and different perspective, which is part of the non-ordinary state of consciousness. But it also has a funny way, if you're working with something like psilocybin or LSD, it has an interesting way of altering the perception of something that would seem ordinary to you. And so that it may seem extraordinary or just different. And because of that, it starts to tweak our belief systems around what actually is. What is the case? What is that actually? Which for me gives a lot of room for creative possibility, rewiring how I believe something. And it also would transform, or often does transform, the sense of the therapeutic relationship, because when you're under the influence of the medicine, your contact with the person that's sitting with you tends to be very different as well. Which, if the therapeutic relationship is struck well, and the session is going well, the depth of rapport and connectivity and movement between therapist and client can be extraordinary, right? Compared to a regular session. And then in the midst of it, evoking different types of experiences for exploration, some of that happens internally, naturally from the medicine. So there's a big gift and a lot of beautiful work that can be done just by allowing the medicines to do their thing. But unlike, again, the medical versions of these therapies where they're relying on the medicine for that, for me, it's been really important to combine the therapeutic relationship into the psychedelic work, because the primary disconnect and disorganizer of our systems tends to revolve around breaks in attachment and lack of trust and rapport between people, and having challenging experiences. So while that person's in an altered state of consciousness and potentially very receptive to seeing things in a different way, it's a great opportunity for a therapist to step in and provide a corrective experience, to offer a different way of being with somebody. And that could look like a variety of different things depending on what they're exploring. So one other piece tied in with the medicines is, I also believe that, this is my own personal perspective, I believe that conventional therapy actually runs into problems due to length, timeline, and that often sessions are maybe like 40 minutes to 60 minutes. And what I've tended to find over the years is that if I'm working with somebody for that short period of time, they're just starting to open up near the end, and then it gets kind of bookmarked going, and we'll connect into that next time and we'll keep working on it, which may seem like a nice slow pace so people can really adapt to things. But from another perspective, it's like you're just hitting something right there. If we just spend a few more minutes with it, you may go through a whole layer of processing that can be very fruitful and supportive for that person before we disembark from the therapeutic session. So for me, 75 minutes or 90 minutes ends up being really prime in the sense of going through a full wave and actually being able to find the other side of it, where some of that processing has been complete rather than just putting it off to next time. I bring that up because you take some mushrooms and all of a sudden you've got 5 hours of that. And for me, that means multiple waves of processing, which when it's handled well can be incredibly healing and moving through a lot of content and the ways that we relate with that content in one time. And that often means that needs to be really a lot of integration on the end. So from that point of view, you might end up with just as many sessions. It's just, they look a little bit different because you're trying to like clean up the pieces afterwards.
You use this term too, I believe, in the training, where you said the therapist as shapeshifter, something like that came up. And it strikes me as particularly true for being a therapist in a psychedelic space, right? Because the medicines are already creating like a shape-shifting experience of reality in a non-ordinary state. But I'm curious for you, what kinds of experiences have you had that maybe even surprised you in terms of, what came online as far as your role, that you intuitively or were guided to help process particular patterns, for clients, whatever feels, appropriate to share. But I'm curious about that as the shapeshifter quality.
I don't know if I'll necessarily share specific like client experiences. What I would say about that is, as a therapist or facilitator, the more we explore and become open to all kinds of different possibilities, the more we disconnect from a particular paradigm or type of experience being the way, as if that needs to be the answer for everybody. And we meet somebody mindfully and openly and actually can build a resonance and rapport between systems, so that I'm actually listening really deeply to what's going on the other side, and both right through the body, states of the mind, things that are coming up. Then essentially I'm more capable of attuning to them and, in a sense, like morphing or readjusting my shape to match what's needed in that moment to them. So it's like I might literally slip through, let's say, the transference of a motherly figure or fatherly figure or a brother, or potentially for a woman that's experienced sexual abuse, potential perpetrator being transferred that direction. And then at that point in time, it's like basically allowing those perceptions to take place, and actually through that resonance, allowing my system to slow down and match where they're at, so I don't have to maintain my shape and my disposition, right? And meet them there, and then have the flexibility to actually shift my shape after that. So it's like allowing that transference to happen to some degree, allowing that to take shape for them so that there is that connection, and then actually lift up and out of that into a new possibility. So there's going to be a lot of consciousness to those steps. And it's not necessarily shape-shifting in the sense of a nahual, where all of a sudden it's like, that man just became a coyote over there.
Well, it could happen, though, and certainly in psychedelic spaces.
In certain psychedelic spaces, for sure. And definitely there have been times when clients, for some reason in my system, clients do seem to perceive a lot of shape-shifting in the way that I look and appear. But that can happen in a lot of different cases with different psychedelics across the board. Mm-hmm. And often meaningfully, because they'll pick up on images that are potentially either mythic in nature that can help them understand things from a different perspective, or it might be relevant to their experience in their family and whatnot. I guess the primary way of shape-shifting that I'm referring to here is more my capacity to resonate with them, slip into their state and be with them in that, instead of trying to hold myself apart from that rigidly, and then being able to like basically shift my shape from that place of resonance, and they'll have a higher likelihood of following me out of that hole that they might be in, or that stuck place that they might be in. And then layering that into another type of shape-shifting that I would say is very natural to a human experience, which is just learning, my capacity to actually adapt and change to my conditions and what's around me, because I'm actually curious about things and actually modifying my state of mind, modifying my functions and my postures and my gestures with my body. I'd say that that's a more fundamental layer of what I would refer to as shape-shifting, as opposed to it being something dramatic in the sense of a change into an animal or something. Yeah.
Well, it strikes me too, the quality of accompaniment, right? That I think you're naming a bit here too, of being able to meet someone, resonate where they're at, and then your own state change in a way models for them, right? New pathways or new abilities to state change. And it also brings to mind, during the training, you played a clip from Brené Brown, right, which is a somewhat popular YouTube clip. It talks about the difference between sympathy and empathy. My understanding of at least how she portrayed it, and which felt powerful to me, was sympathy was sort of, I mean, the way it was portrayed often was sort of like, oh, well, it could be better, like it's not that bad, like, or say, oh, that's too bad for you. Like it's pointing out somebody's state, but actually not offering empathy, which empathy, according to how she described it, was like accompanying with, right? Like being able to acknowledge without trying to change the person, right? Which in many ways, ironically or not, actually can lead to them shifting states, right? By actually meeting them and being like, wow, that is tough what you've just gone through, or, again, not trying to change them.
Yeah. So in one case, in the sympathy case, following what you said, I would say that the person offering sympathy is often stuck in one of their managing roles. And they're often managing their own emotional state, especially if things are even unconsciously or subconsciously being triggered by the other person. It's like somebody across from you has just experienced a loss in their life. Somebody's passed away and they're grieving or feeling really upset about it. Somebody that's offering sympathy might actually be not stepping into that empathic state with them to basically avoid recognizing and becoming more cognizant of or perceptive of their own grief and the ways that things have hit them over the years. They're essentially keeping themselves out of their own well of emotional energy. So that would be kind of a social nicety that's offered, an attempt to connect that's really not a connection, in order really to try and manage things. Or if they're trying to manage things on their side, they think that their attempt in speaking like that is going to be supportive by trying to manage things on the other side rather than just being with. Yeah.
And I want to name this to listeners, again, it may or may not be stereotypical or cliche or not, but for men listening, oftentimes there seems to be a challenge with a female partner at least, who oftentimes are characterized as maybe more emotional or more desiring to be met emotionally, right? And men, at least, again, because of conditioning or whatever, tend to orient towards the rational, logical, right? And of course, those are disconnects when it goes both ways. But if a woman partner is saying like, hey, I'm feeling really sad, or this issue came up, and man typically, kind of cliched, jumps to try to fix it. Oh, well, you could just, do that. And, there's dissatisfaction, of course, often on the woman's side, who's like, no, I don't need you to try to fix it. I just need you to be with me. Right. And for me, again, cliche or not, that seems a hack that has certainly been effective often when I remember that, actually, when, my own discomfort with, say, my partner's emotional state, when I look at it from this lens, right, that's actually what's going on. It's like, I'm feeling uncomfortable by your emotions, so I'm going to offer some way to fix it, thinking that that's helpful. When oftentimes, it's not actually. Just meeting them where they're at actually is what the need requires.
Right. Tying it back into the therapeutic sense of things, could say that the person shifted from simply being curious about the other person, which allows space for that person to actually show up and, in essence, like communicate to you or teach you what's going on for them, into a space where they're trying to manage it in some way. And as soon as that management system cuts in, it is a way of us protecting. We're trying to organize or be the creator in this world where I can make something happen. I can organize it in this way so that it's better, which actually can become quite unhinged from actually listening to what's really going on. Yeah.
It reminds me again of another hack, let's say of a relational hack based on this therapeutic understanding, I think, is curiosity, as you just said, right? Like if I shift from trying to fix, or, oftentimes in a relationship where maybe I feel like, I might have done something that actually created the discomfort or aggression or judgment from my partner, if I can still remain curious, right, of like, oh, wow, okay, how do you feel about that? Or you're telling me how you feel. Okay, and what does that lead to, Not to be detached from it or kind of sidestep, but actually to remain in the curiosity instead of defensiveness. I find oftentimes that leads to actual connection and actual harmony, right, and repair, which is so vital in a healthy, functioning relationship.
Absolutely. People love being heard, hands down. Now, the interesting thing is, love being heard doesn't necessarily mean listening to a story for 30 minutes.
For sure.
There actually are ways to deepen the sense of being heard by getting curious about how it's being embodied. If somebody's actually being perceived in the emotions of it, in the feelings and the sensations and the postural changes, it's not that you have to be like, especially outside of a therapeutic environment, calling all that out, because that could seem intrusive to somebody that was not looking for any kind of therapy. But being attentive to that, it's like asking for a little bit of detail around like, how does that actually feel in your system? Slows a person down out of that story and allows them to connect into their body, and they'll actually feel more heard than if they just got to spiel off the whole story. Yeah.
I'd love to return again to the Chiron and the time in your life now that we spoke earlier about the wounded healer. And yeah, I'd be curious to hear, what is this time for you? Like what in your own upbringing, again, that's led you to be a healer in this way, right? Because again, it seems to be a common theme, right? That, of course, what we maybe didn't experience when we were young, or what we saw was, causing conflict or mayhem or harm for us, becomes that which we are in service to in order to offer something back, perhaps to, our younger self, right? And so I'm curious for you how that process has been, and also how it's led you to what is the edge now for you of this threshold into this next chapter.
Yeah. I'm glad you came back to this, because there was a little bit more there that I wanted to say earlier that just wasn't finding purchase in my mind, at least not entirely. I would definitely say that I am working in ways that are heavily influenced by how I was raised. And that shows up in a variety of ways. There's a lot of different experiences and beliefs that kind of came online that formed that and have led me to working in this way. I'm going to offer one example. And then one example would be that I, as a child, would encounter, again, physical punishment, shaming, things like that. And the typical way that would play out, pretty much every time that I can actually remember, was that I would be punished in some way and hurt in various levels, including sometimes physically. And parents would leave the space. I'd be on my own for a while. Then I'd go down for dinner or do whatever was required or whatever was next for family, and people would engage in different conversations and never come back to it. There was never any attempt to help me understand why what happened. There was no attempt to rebuild rapport or connection in a way that related to those experiences. No apologies ever given, acknowledging that maybe they overacted or acted in ways that were based on their own reactivity and responses, and maybe it wasn't true for me. Tied in with that, there was a lot of projection continually of like what was demanded of me from them, and not a listening ear that was actually curious about where I was headed and what I was doing, especially around those points of pain. So I became really good over the years at helping people become accountable for their own beliefs and reactivity. I became really proficient in supporting people to connect in with themselves and reflect on how they've been acting in life, and how they might be able to modify and adjust that without it having to mean anything about somebody else in their life. You know, what's your own agency in this, and how can you be self-accountable, and then rebuild those relationships and rebuild rapport. And to tie it into my own need for that, it could be said that I just feel safer around people when they're doing that. So for me to actually construct environments where I'm working with groups and working with individuals where they're doing that all the time, I'm like, I can relax because I'm in a situation right now where I'm probably not going to be hurt. Right. So that's been a big driver. On the flip side of that, on the creative and healthy direction side of that, I would say that I've actually created exactly what I wanted. I wanted people that were emotionally available. I wanted people that had deeper conversations about this human experience and were sharing about themselves and the way that they're changing, and they're getting curious about me and the way that I'm changing. And I've surrounded myself with people like that. So there's two sides to that coin. There's like that, definitely that healthy forward momentum of what's possible when we're working together in this way. And there's the pain body that actually, you know, at least partially prompted me to be working in this way. Yeah.
And do you see what is the resolution to that, if any? Like, maybe that's what I hear you're saying, right? Like the sort of, you know, the impulse to positively generate, you know, communities of awareness and accountability and all this that can make you feel, again, you won't be hurt again. Like, so I hear you saying, not necessarily that's a negative driver in a way, but I also hear you saying maybe now you're actually kind of becoming aware of the deeper layers of like what's beyond maybe that kind of undercurrent of what's driven you to create. Am I hearing right?
A little bit, if you're kind of segueing potentially towards like what's next for me.
Yeah.
To backtrack just a little bit, the work that I've been doing, the unconscious drivers, now that they've become more conscious as to like, oh wow, like that's what I was doing, there's more ease around that, and there's still a little bit of mindfulness around like when threads of that still show up, you know, how that still might be influencing me, because in those moments when those threads show up, I'll actually find myself actually pushing on a group or on a client to kind of prove a point in that way, which as soon as I catch myself doing that, I realize it's like part of that old program that's still coming through to try and be safe. So using my own tools in a sense to self-investigate and back off and just get curious about all of it again. Right. And the more that I've done that and working with different groups, what I'm finding more and more is that in essence, the very nature of us being together in these ways, yes, it is healing for the individual in their life stories and their beliefs, and they're finding new ways to operate. But more than anything, we're striking a new way of relating as a community together, which I know is very much an interest in what you're doing in this world. And that's spreading out. Like their social spheres are becoming more layered and sophisticated with emotional intelligence and connectivity and friendship. That's trickling into families. And it's really beautiful to see how it's rippling out and having a positive effect, not just because of the content and the practices that we're doing, but just the way of being, how we are with each other. And for me, at this point in time, I'd say that that's the most important part. I'm much less worried about the content. Even the training you just did, I'm not sold on the specific content as if it's the right way of doing this. It's a particular modality. It's a particular framework that I appreciate. More than anything, the important part of that gathering is that we're together in a good way and we're supporting each other. And if we can do that with each other and set that as a more consistent theme, then ideally that's being shared elsewhere as those people go out and re-engage their families and community. Yeah. For me, as far as what's next, I really have a hard time wrapping myself around this because I feel like I'm mentoring. This is going to be seemingly totally tangential, and I don't even have a lot to say about it, but I've been alerted by numerous people that are not related that I have a particular way of I've heard it described in different ways, but like projecting myself energetically into different spaces, different layers of consciousness. And from that place, I'm actually working on them or other people. Some people have perceived me doing it to other people. Some people have perceived me doing it to them. And it's like a very common story that's been showing up to the point where I'm like no longer able to just say, oh, thanks. That's
like astral projection kind of thing, or astral healing.
Sometimes it's been described as that.
Okay.
But the strange thing is I'm not actually even conscious of it. So it's like I have no control over it in any conscious sense, right? But it appears to be happening because I've gotten a lot of different reports on it now where I'm like, okay, I guess this is actually a thing. And so for me, over the next few months, I am kind of taking some steps to actively see if I can engage it more consciously. And I don't even know what that means for the future of how I'm working with folks, if it'll change anything. You know, the externalized version of how I work may stay exactly the same. I just may have a deeper connection to that. So I may be potentially optimizing my work on other levels that I currently don't even know how to describe. So
following the thread.
Yeah. So what's emerging for me, to use that word again.
This brings me to, and again, you spoke about it also in the sense of the ripples of community and the way of being together, to the principle, at least maybe the last principle in Hakomi, of unity. But this idea that, let's read a bit, the principle of unity expresses in the inherent wholeness of the experience the idea that there are no aspects of this experience, this life, or this universe that exist in isolation. All apparent components within this complex web of wholeness are interdependent. And so it says here, whether the part is a person, a sensation, a thought, a group, an image, if they are being held as separate in some way from the whole, an apparent breakdown in communication will ensue. And therefore it seems reconnection, of course. At any point, this is where I'm sensing this connection to the individual and then to the collective healing. That as, you know, and again, I'm wary of this. It feels a bit like a kind of spiritual bypass, a way of like, if only individuals heal, then the collective will heal, you know, because I'm not saying this principle of unity, I think it's actually very true. And at the same time, I think that there's the danger of kind of, you know, infinite self-work, right? This whole thing of a culture of, I'm just constantly working on myself, and then that inherently is good for the collective. Like that can be a trap, obviously. But I am struck by, as you're saying, this kind of holographic nature of, like, you know, you're doing work that ripples right through the individual, you know, that individuals that get affected and their own patterns get healed, and then they don't ripple out. And so what I'm trying to do is kind of wonder about together around this relationship between the like organism of humanity as a whole, right, and our seemingly trajectory of annihilation, right, by many accounts. And then these, sometimes I've heard them referred to as imaginal cells, right? Like this idea of, you know, all these different pockets of effort and healing and you know, imaginal responsive organisms to the health of the whole, you know, which I feel like you're a part of. Like I would make that clearer case. And just as I'm been spending a lot of my time in terms of shifting consciousness through film in particular, right, of trying to implant these ways of being together, which are more sane, certainly. And so I guess that's my overall question to you is, as you look out now on the horizon of really this choice point, it seems, right, with humanity, that it's either kind of come into more coherence, right, come into a kind of relational harmony in a way, or we see the consequences unfolding. You know, of course, even now is raging in Gaza and Palestine and the rest. Like clearly this part of people that can't talk to each other and end up creating more mayhem, you know, it seems to be apparent, obviously. But I guess that's what I'm trying to say is how do you see this collective or this individual effort and the collective effort mirroring each other as we're trying to bring about some kind of more beautiful future?
Yeah. I'm going to start really simply with, and partly because my wheelhouse or place where I'm practiced and experienced is more on like one-on-one and small group formats. Like I'm not an quote unquote activist that's out trying to make systems change in different ways necessarily.
Well, it depends on what you think an activist is. Right?
True.
Yeah.
Absolutely true. You know, because I do, well, I don't just believe, like I see the work we're doing together as rippling out and making change and striking out new possibilities for sure. Mm-hmm. But if we bring it back even to a one-on-one engagement, personal work, so somebody working on themselves, I'm going to say there's a fundamental flaw in thinking that it's one-on-one or like individual work, that it's self-work. From this, even tying it back into a Hakomi perspective and the therapeutic relationship, when somebody steps into my office, it's the relationship that is in therapy, not the person. The way that the person's embodying their history and, moving and communicating, holding themselves around me, interacting with me, is interfacing with the way that I'm actually doing the exact same thing. No matter how much work I've done, I've got a history, I've got filters. I have a particular personality and way of being that isn't all just free and clear. There are habituated ways. And that's actually a healthy thing because it actually makes us efficient. It's just that they need to be revisited every now and then to optimize so that they're like updated basically to the current environment and what's actually going on. And that was a little segue, or tangent. But bringing it back to the therapy is actually how are we relating together? And how do we shift back from this place of like habituated self-regulation where it's just me and I need to control things into like, we're actually doing this together. And when we are able to stably and safely and lovingly shift back into that place of co-regulation, then a whole different possibility arises. And then from that place of possibility, as we investigate and explore it and learn together, and I'm constantly transformed by doing this work with others, so it's a very active mutual thing. Then from there, technically on the self side, they can take on new forms of self-regulation, new forms of taking care of themselves they do become new management systems. They do become new habits, but hopefully healthier than the previous ones if we're doing good work. And yes, that helps the person move forward in life, but the importance of the whole event was that we did it together. And my work really with groups and with individuals is to target that we're doing it together. So when we're talking about systems change and whatnot, it's accessing the capacity to slow down, resonate, connect with others, and change things together. Right? Change us. Because from a unity perspective, it's not saying that we're all the same thing. That's actually one way of bypassing and getting stuck in a management system. Somebody that's let's say an activist for social change in the sense of liberal ways of thinking, that we should consider everybody else, that can become just as much of a habituated state that's a position that's managing and projecting on others that they should be a particular way, just often like you should be like me if we're going to be safe here and work together, and denying the person that's a conservative, let's say. And I'm not making one point of view or the other right. It's just, it's already a break in relationship, even though one person's claiming they want relationship. Right? So, or wants difference, but not your difference. So for me, it's more like, how do we move through all of that and actually come back into connection, period, regardless of your beliefs. And if I'm really open, I can sit here and discuss things with you and actually be curious about it. And at the same time, trust that you've had potentially particular training in life that taught you that it was really painful or necessary to think in particular ways, right? That you had to be a particular way if you're going to be safe here. And if I can really just humbly and curiously interface with you from that perspective, I'm usually in a good place. As soon as I start thinking that you should be like me, I'm going to struggle.
Well, I appreciate you wove that in, because I think for me, what I hear in that is the skill of being in relationship. Like, maybe I would just call it that, right? Like, so especially at a time now when there's so much incoherence, there's so much distrust, there's so much polarization, positionality, fragmentation, that actually the skill of being in relationship, not agreeing with everybody, right? But actually being curious and being able to find some kind of, mutual dynamic possibility between folks, right? Seems to be like an absolute vital skill. Right. And that if we're entrenched and in our positions and polarized, and, if you don't agree with me, you're canceled. Like, obviously then there's no possibility. Maybe it feels like there's very little possibility of actual transformation before relationship is established.
Right. Right. And for me, this ties into a necessary part of unity that's not really spoken to in the manual there, but a precursor to actually coming together functionally in unity is differentiation. Before a healthy, proper differentiation, you either have a situation, and often they're happening at the same time, where you have a merging on one side where you're overly identified and bound to something as if it's just you or just the way that something is. And you have a dissociation on the other side where something else isn't even present as a possibility. Right? So there's kind of an absence of something and an over-identification or over-presence of something else. And that merging, that over-identification needs to differentiate for healthy effect, to pull apart the factors there and to see more details in it, and to know myself, differentiated from another person, differentiated from a particular activity or particular way of being. Even the dissociation could be seen as a loss of differentiation again, because we don't even have the other side of it. We just have my side. So bringing something into consciousness that wasn't there before provides a second or another, which gives me a chance to differentiate from it. Right. And once we're differentiated and we have two different things, we can actually build a relationship between those things. While we're merged or dissociated, there's no chance for relationship. So, and that relationship between the parts is actually the unity. The unity is not just one thing. If it was, it's more like cancer.
Yeah, I just had this image and I appreciate that. Essentially the difference between differentiation, perhaps as you've been speaking it, and how one knows itself because of being able to differentiate and be in relationship to another. And then a kind of oppositional binary thinking, right? Which is this idea that because things are differentiated, they're inherently in opposition to each other.
Exactly.
Yeah. And that to me is the trap of the time.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's like, how do we recognize that actually as a possibility for relationship as opposed to opposition? Yeah.
My goodness, this could be a long, rich thread to go down. And our time is just about complete, Trevor, and I've so appreciated our time. And as a phrase came up, one of the participants in the training, in our moment, we had a dyad. This fellow, Niku is his name. We had a dyad where we were going back and forth and, really dropped into a deep space. And he closed it by saying something like, so appreciated this pocket of the universe, that we were in together for a moment. And I wish to offer that to you. Appreciate this pocket of the universe that we've created together.
Thank you, Ian. I appreciate the invitation, the opportunity to meet with you in this way and to spend the last few days with you. And yeah, it feels rich, rich with possibility and connection. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Mythic Masculine. If you enjoyed what you heard, please consider leaving a review on Apple Podcasts and sharing this episode on your social media. You're also welcome to join the Mythic Masculine on Substack to get all episodes in your inbox, as well as special essays and become a paid subscriber. And finally, check out themythicmasculine.com for upcoming in-person events, ritual weekends, online courses, and more.